Welcome to the Compact Podcast. Today we'll discuss the war in Israel and the many reactions to it. Joined by Sohrab Ahmari, Nina Power, and Geoff Shullenberger, and I'm Matthew Schmitz. 10 days after Hamas's attack on Israel, the entire world's attention was grabbed by reports and wildly conflicting reports. An explosion at a hospital in Gaza operated by the Anglican Episcopal Church. 500 people or more had been killed. Some lower estimates of the casualty count have been offered, and it became apparent that the explosion occurred in the parking lot. The building is, for the most part, intact. It's been a media story as well as war story, as Geoff wrote for us this week in Compact in his essay, Baudrillard in Gaza. Geoff, do you want to just tell us a bit about the relevance of French theory to this battle in the Middle East, which might not be immediately apparent to all our listeners?
Right. Baudrillard had some cultural impact prior to this, but it was in fact in relation to a prior conflict in the Middle East, the first Persian Gulf War between, the US and Iraq, Saddam Hussein's Iraq, that brought him to the attention of a lot of people who might not have heard of him previously. Scandalously titled an essay or a series of 3 essays, different variations on the Gulf War did not take place. And of course, this was seen as a kind of absurd, postmodern reductio ad absurdum of just kind of denying plain reality. His point was, as many have pointed out before, was rather more subtle, which was to note that you can't change there's sort of representational technologies that accompany warfare without changing the nature of warfare itself. And, what he was observing at the time was, and, some others like myself may be old enough to remember this, the incredible visual spectacle on television of that invasion. It was extremely notable at the time. Many commented, the sort of video game-like quality of how, cruise missiles and sort of various kinds of aerial bombing attacks were represented to us in this kind of strange, immersive way that was quite novel, even though, of course, there had been heavily mediatized wars previously. His argument was sort of that, it's a question of temporality in part, right? That you have previous history of war where there's war as an event, right? And then there are attempts to represent and make sense of it. One thing I often think of are the great representations of war in Stendhal's The Charterhouse of Parma and Tolstoy's War and Peace, where you have war as kind of this bewildering, unrepresentable, mess of reality that the characters kind of struggle to encompass and make sense of because they've only experienced it through these kind of, neat latter-day encapsulations in the form of history books or, various other kinds of accounts that sort of neatly summed everything up once it was over. Whereas now, what happens with initially all kinds of simultaneous broadcasting, and then, of course, with the evolution of technology into everybody having the sort of means of capture and representation on them at all times, is that, war unfolds and is simultaneously being captured and represented, as it unfolds, and that this means that the event of war is kind of swallowed up into the process of trying to represent it. And so, what this can often mean is that the event itself kind of vanishes or becomes this weird kind of hollow chasm around which all of these images and videos and commentaries and interpretations kind of circulate and proliferate. And so that's kind of what we've seen with this hospital blast, which, was originally described as straightforwardly as an Israeli airstrike, seemingly that leveled this hospital and killed 500 or more people. Then there was sort of debate about the responsibility of it. But then in the meantime, there was this kind of bizarre switcheroo where the nature of the event itself was no longer the same thing. Like the reference of the discussion went from being a hospital that was destroyed to being damage inflicted on a parking lot adjacent to the hospital, which, and obviously if you can imagine a whole building being destroyed, it implies enormous numbers of casualties, whereas blast in a parking lot adjacent to it is quite a bit more ambiguous in terms of what that implies. The discussion continued, but the event itself was entirely indeterminate. Like people weren't necessarily even talking about the same thing, but in a sense it didn't matter, right? Because the whole kind of representational swirl of images, videos, analyses, interpretations just kind of took on a life of its own, right? And in the meantime, the reality itself was occluded by this process. People could continue having the discussion even though they didn't even agree about a fundamental question of what the reference of the discussion even was. So it was a very strange thing to observe. I'm not sure how much we'll ever know, although it may be that we will, through various kinds of satellite imagery and other kinds of reconstructions, get some kind of more objective facts. And Baudrillard does not deny that the possibility that those exist and can be accessed. But what he points out is that the whole way in which we apprehend things, largely sidelines those and makes them secondary, right? And so the question is, okay, perhaps we will ultimately have access to, what seems like a more objective accounting of this incident, but in a sense, it may not actually matter very much, right? Because the logic of how this war is unfolding through representation, conflicting interpretations, etc., is largely and significantly detached from that, what he calls the logic of facts. So that's why I think this scandalous Gulf War did not take place thesis is relevant here, right? Because it has to do with the way that war shifts when it is, being documented, represented, broadcast, analyzed, interpreted at every point. And therefore, the actual events themselves are strangely take on this kind of undecidability and hollowness. Like what would seem to be the most straightforward question is just like, what is the actual thing at the center of this? But in a way, that's the most vague and opaque matter in this entire affair. And yet most people seem to proceed as if there is sufficient certainty to, carry on building these narratives and disputing alternative narratives and so on.
One thing I was struck by in this context, which I think probably a lot of people haven't seen because there's been so much happening, there was a statement issued by Christian leaders in the Holy Land, not just the leaders of the Anglican Church there, which is a very important institution given the kind of imprint of British colonialism, but also the Catholic and various Eastern Orthodox churches issued a joint statement about the blast at the hospital, decrying it as a crime and an atrocity. Certainly, violence at a hospital is a scandalous thing. What was notable is that in the press conference they held, they said, we don't know who did it. This is, a crime and atrocity, but we don't know who did it. And, it can be difficult to characterize an event in moral terms that imply a certain kind of culpability if you don't know if it was deliberate or accidental or what party was responsible. So it's interesting that even among churchmen, I think there's been, a rush to interpretation, despite at least a professed agnosticism about the underlying facts.
Yeah, and I would note, interestingly, there seems to be a kind of repeat of this with regard to an Orthodox church in Gaza, St. Porphyrios, where, again, yesterday there were reports that this church, which is a very old, 1,000-year-old church, was destroyed. Many denunciations of this, but it's actually quite hard to tell what the extent of the damage was. The most recent reports I've seen suggest, there was some damage to the church compound. The initial reports suggested that this church was entirely destroyed. And then actually, if you go back, there's an AP fact check from like a week ago that apparently there were previous reports that this church had been destroyed, and the AP denies those claims that in fact it wasn't. So it does seem that these kinds of ideas circulating, and then, as you bring up, that there are sort of, all of these various authorities, not just the official spokespeople of the different governments involved or quasi-governmental entities involved, but, different kinds of authorities like church authorities that sort of enter into the fray of trying to, assert something about what is unfolding. But it's an extremely murky business.
We've covered in Compact the profound reverberations these events have been having in America, campus circles and activist circles. The New York Times had a news story this week, response among Jewish progressives, people who are active in progressive and democratic politics, and their surprise at it. The story observed the lack of more forceful and instantaneous condemnation of the Hamas attack on Israel shocked some liberal Jews who remembered the outpouring of support from other Americans after the 2018 mass shooting at a Pittsburgh synagogue by a gunman inspired by the far right. I thought that was a very interesting moment in that article which gestured at without really discussing the possibility that these things, even something like anti-Semitism, which almost everyone would profess to oppose, it's filtered through very specific political frameworks, and those differ wildly between different actors. So people who very feelingly condemn something like the shooting at that Pittsburgh synagogue may be quite indifferent to Black Lives Matter posting paraglider memes or what have you. Just, I think, interesting to observe that dynamic. Maybe it's just to be expected. Any of you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a similar situation in London. About a week ago, I went to a kind of pro-Israel demonstration outside Downing Street, so seat of power. And it was kind of interesting to note that it really was largely Jewish people there. And it kind of lacked, I would say, sort of solidarity from other people who would generally attend progressive protests. Contrast this small gathering, which was largely to talk about the hostages and the Israelis that had been killed by Hamas, with the massive pro-Palestinian protests that took place in London and other cities, in which you did have a range of people. So people from the socialist left, the far left, the anarchist left, probably centre left in some ways, various other protest movements, including environmental movement. You can see people like Greta Thunberg somehow speaking out about Gaza today, and, as well as a kind of large Muslim attendees from various Arab countries. So I think there is a genuine sense in which Jewish people are not feeling solidarity from people that they would have otherwise expected. And I think we can also see this split in the culture industry, in the art world and so on. There's been a couple of letters that have just been published, open letters, one published in Art Forum, signed by lots of artists, including kind of big names like, Judith Butler's not an artist, but she signed it, Nan Goldin and various other, famous artists, calling for institutions to petition governments to call for a ceasefire. It's a carefully worded letter, but it's clearly, in a way, seeking to justify Palestinian response, if not mentioning Hamas. And I think it's fair to say that the art world, at least its workers, its culture workers, are generally pro-Palestinian, whereas many of the backers of art galleries are not. And I think there's an interesting split in the cultural and elite class over precisely this issue. Also, tensions around free speech. I think maybe I mentioned this last time, but, the left that has been calling for cancelling people for the past decade is now very upset that countries such as Germany seem to be banning pro-Palestinian, or at least certain slogans at protests, if not the protests themselves, and there's a sort of big tension there. It's free speech when it's something I support and not when it isn't. So I think this is causing kind of huge splits in cultural and political elites, and the fog of war stuff just serves to confirm bias in any direction. And I think that, just to finish on Geoff's point about Baudrillard, yes, the absolute coincidence with the image and the current event, there's no longer any gap at all. But this is also has implications for the spectator or the viewer, right, who is also somehow called upon to immediately speak about situations that he or she has absolutely no idea about, which then contributes even more to actual real life events, storming of embassies, protests and so on. So it's this kind of chaotic, semiotic melange with real world effects, as viewers somehow caught between, or spectators caught between, some compulsion to respond. The artists are calling on institutions to take a political stand. Why should a museum take a political stand on anything? This is all very, very murky. The kind of hyper politicization of all institutions. I think we're fully in that world now.
We've also seen this in universities. So universities were, unusually hesitant or delayed in releasing their standard statements about what occurred in Israel on October 7th, that usually whenever there's some sort of minor world event that's perceived as sort of traumatic to some constituency or group, they have to issue this statement, which conventionally includes platitudes and then, information about university mental health services. So there is this kind of therapeutic dimension to it, which I wrote about last week in relation to Frantz Fanon, the sort of premier intellectual of kind of decolonization, who did actually tie these kind of anti-colonial causes to a kind of therapeutic way of thinking, which is a notable point here. But, the point is the universities kind of seem to have trouble figuring out how to articulate this. And I think that this delay did express this problem that they face, right, which is that they've cultivated a constituency of student activists, of a lot of faculty and staff who largely see Palestinian rights as aligned with sort of Black Lives Matter and other progressive causes. And then a donor base, which tends to be much more tends to have a large number of pro-Israel people within it. We've seen this fallout because of incidents at some Ivy League universities, Harvard and Penn, where, students made various kinds of statements or faculty made various kinds of statements in favor of the Palestinian cause, seeming to support Hamas's actions. And then you've actually had donors come out and say they won't donate to these institutions anymore. And, Nina mentions the art world. There is this art forum letter, which I found kind of ridiculous in some respects, because it seemed to be just asking that these institutions issue these inane statements of solidarity or whatever that, clearly do nothing. These people really think that, the Museum of Modern Art deploring Israel's occupation of it or, siege of the Gaza Strip is going to, have any impact on the Israeli government's actions. I just don't know what to think. You're living in La La Land, but it really is more a way of trying to ensure that the institutions they're affiliated with, meet certain ideological or pass certain ideological litmus tests, because otherwise there's a kind of feeling of impurity about affiliation with them. But what's interesting here is that, you do, certainly in New York City, have an interesting split between the kind of art philanthropist class and the class of sort of artists, curators, etc. This doesn't necessarily have to do with Israel, but, one thing that I remember from a couple decades ago was people realizing, oh my God, all these arts institutions in New York are named after the Koch brothers, right? When people first started realizing who the Koch brothers were, it's oh wait, actually all of these art institutions are funded by these right-wing billionaires we think are evil. And then, similarly, you have someone like Ronald Lauder, who's a very significant art collector, philanthropist in New York City, who is also a major figure in kind of donating to Zionist causes, former president of the World Jewish Congress. And so, you have a number of people of that profile who are sort of mega donors who basically prop up various arts institutions who are robustly pro-Israel and have, also put a lot of money into that. So there is, as Nina says, a real split here between the people who essentially bankroll these institutions and the people on their payrolls. You see something similar unfolding in universities, and it will be extremely interesting to see how all of this plays out.
What has struck me is the continued inability of a lot of these institutions to feel any solidarity or any sense of pain when it comes to Jewish lives and Jewish civilian lives. And that phenomenon has many roots. But I think at bottom, we have to admit that it's an ideological one, and it has to do with something. I try to put myself in these people's shoes. I think it goes something like this. Normally, if there's a terror attack in which women are kidnapped and then later are seen being paraded through Gaza with bloody crotches, that is absolutely unspeakable. But when it comes to this particular issue, you have to filter it through, well, who did what first? And you begin into a kind of genealogy of victimization, in part because Israel now is such a powerful nation state, in part because despite actually it being a very popular project, a sort of Zionist project being a popular one among the left, right up until, let's say, I think the turning point is the 1967 war, Six-Day War. It has now become very unpopular among progressives. It's seen as like the last vestige of Western colonialism. So what used to be seen as a national liberation movement is now no longer that. But at any rate, so that when you're confronted with these images, people who, like Nina and Geoff have both mentioned, would normally be horrified by the scene of, women with bloody crotches being paraded by terrorists through the streets of Gaza. It's not a laughing matter. It's just so grim that one can't help but sort of have that reaction, that you can't come outright and just condemn it. Universities, for example, would have saved themselves a lot of heartache, either by not having made a pattern of responding to every mass shooting in the United States, every single political thing that happens anywhere. Or if you're going to do it, here's one where whatever you think of the broader moral equities of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you should condemn that sort of behavior. So, I mean, that's a very bland and obvious statement in some ways, but I find myself torn between the kind of people who are writing letters of outrage to these universities, and in so many cases, people I don't agree with on many issues, but I take some satisfaction in them telling these university presidents, who are normally so capable of drafting unambiguous condemnatory statements, especially in areas where actual moral equities are ambiguous, they're capable of tremendous certitude. But then when it comes to this case, to use this mealy-mouthed language about, we deplore the violence that has broken out in Israel and Palestine, and we are sorry about the violence, without naming Hamas or describing the actions. But I really do think it's this, what people get trapped in, and what the real temptation is, to just be like, well, who started it? It feels like the West, or Israel as a stand-in for the West, started this, and so it's really kind of okay. It's not what they say, but that's the implication ultimately, that the people on the other side of this conflict, yeah, they do some ugly things, but you can understand because like the West started this, or Israel started this chain of grievances, rather than just looking at an action and saying, wow, a woman got raped. Wow, children got mutilated, even if they didn't get even if as many children as were initially reported didn't get beheaded, children were tortured and mutilated with their hands tied behind their backs, as Israeli first responders testified very credibly. They were trying to piece together because the kids and the adults had their hands tied behind their backs, and using forensic evidence, they're trying to figure out which got to watch the other get tortured. Was it the parents who watched the children being tortured, or the children who first got to watch their parents being tortured, all while some of the other kind of Hamas terrorists were just sort of casually hanging out in their living rooms and picking at the Shabbat dinners that had been, Shabbat meals that had been prepared before them. Like, you are confronted with that. Progressive university administrators, it's okay to say that's barbarism, that's evil. I don't know. I mean, you can unpack this psychology that leads people not to be able to say that for a long time. But I ultimately think it's this misguided way of being like, going back in your own ideologized way down the chain of victimization to figure out who the ultimate victim is, and whether or not the other side has moral claims that deserve to be respected.
There was a really telling document in the magazine Jewish Currents on this topic. The title of it was, "Were Hamas's attacks motivated by anti-Semitism?" Article presents itself as summarizing the opinions of experts who can be relied on. And these experts say that, one, the scholar Tarek Bakoni says it's important to push back against any effort to try to suggest this was driven by anti-Semitism, because doing that also completely erases any motivation that imprisoned people might have in breaking out of their prison. He says that, Hamas's the attack on October 10, that resulted in the deaths of so many civilians, wasn't driven by hatred and bloodlust, but rather by a regime of oppression that has held 2 million Palestinians captive for 16 years and was ready to continue to do that indefinitely. So, as you say, Sohrab, it's understood through a lens of oppression, and to act against that oppression can't be considered anti-Semitism, because oppression is structural, it's interrelated, and anti-Semitism has to be part of that structure. So if you're resisting the structure, you're in a way resisting the anti-Semitism. This article from Jewish Currents also uncritically quotes a 2017 political document released by Hamas. This document was seen as a kind of rhetorical climb down from Hamas's founding charter, which quotes from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion and posits killing Jews as a Muslim religious obligation. But in this document that Jewish Currents...
The new one.
the new one, the 2017 one that Jewish Currents quotes positively, Hamas argues that anti-Semitism and the persecution of Jews is, quote, phenomena fundamentally linked to European history, unquote. If you had to kind of put that in just more direct terms, it would be something like this. A white European from a Christian culture, he can be guilty of anti-Semitism. A brown Palestinian, likely Muslim, can't commit an anti-Semitism. So you have to understand the kind of positionality. You have to understand these power dynamics. And so that's really very important for understanding how large swaths of the left understand these events.
It's a mistake to trace various forms of anti-Semitism, or before there was a kind of racial component to it, which I think a kind of racialized anti-Semitism was incepted in the heart of Europe in relatively recently. But certainly there was anti-Judaism in both. Christianity, we must admit, there's a wonderful story that a priest I love told me this story where he was giving commentary during Pope Benedict's visit to the United States. I believe that was in 2008, if I am not mistaken. And he was giving on commentary, and he was on a show alongside a modern contemporary television personality. They're giving commentary as the mass, the papal mass is going on. And there's in the reading, there's the reference to the Christians were hiding for fear of the Jews from the Gospel of St. John. And in between the breaks, the anchor turned to my friend who's the priest and said, "Oh, I noticed they said for fear of the Jews. I thought the Second Vatican Council, didn't they change that in the gospel?" So, in the same way that, keep that in mind. I mean, that kind of, there is an element, at least not in the inherent in the gospel per se, but certainly that has been interpreted in anti-Judaic ways by Christians. There is that element in Islam for sure, because, there's quoted in the Hamas charter is this bit in the Quran in which, in the end of days, the Muslims will basically slaughter the Jews, and slightly paraphrasing, but only slightly. And when the Jew will go hide behind a tree or a stone, the stone or the tree will cry out, "Oh, Muslim, come, there's a Jew hiding behind me." Hilariously, it says, except whatever, I never remember there's an exceptional tree that doesn't give up the Jews that are hiding behind it, as the Quranic quote goes, because it's a tree of the Jews or something like that. That's quoted in the Hamas charter. And I think it's just worth noting that let's be honest here. And that is taken far more seriously by a certain kind of Islamist in terms of what it says about Jews as a corporate body than the uncomfortable bits of the Gospel of St. John are taken by the mass body of Catholics or Christians today. And that difference matters. The second point, and I just want to say this, is in terms of the sort of genealogy of fault. Actually, with respect to the West Bank, not that, anything that Israel does in the West Bank would justify this kind of barbarism. But with respect to Gaza, it's even less justified, because Ariel Sharon beginning in 2005, just unilaterally withdrew every single settlement, every single Israeli troop out of Gaza. And this is something that I have not seen in any of the discourse, at least with respect to the latest cycle. Israel uprooted Jewish settlements at great pain, right? You had IDF soldiers going in and grabbing the settlers and, basically expelling them from the Gaza Strip at the behest of a figure who was seen as a very kind of right-wing Zionist figure, Ariel Sharon. So I think that it's worth noting that, look, does that mean that Israel just went out of its way to create the most pleasant environment for the citizens of Gaza? No, but sometimes very intelligent, otherwise well-informed people treat what happens in Gaza as though it's identical to what happens in the West Bank. Not at all. They continue to use words like occupation, etc., not at all taking into account that, for example, none of the military rules that used to govern the Gaza Strip when it was still controlled directly by Israel apply anymore. They've all been sort of abrogated because Israelis gave up control unilaterally. Last point, and the tragedy of this is, one of the things I used to hear left Israelis and centrist Israelis say in terms of how to make peace was, okay, the Oslo type process had failed. We're not going to pursue that anymore. But we always have the Sharon option with the West Bank. That is, we unilaterally withdraw behind certain safe lines. And then, we build up our walls, as it were, for defense. and then just let the Palestinians do what they will with large swaths of the West Bank. Some of my friends in Israel who are definitely centrist or center left are saying is that for them, what happened on October 7th put an end to the dream of unilateral withdrawal as a way to solve the conflict, right? It's not a peace deal. It's just, pardon my French, like F off. We're going to go. See ya. We have our barriers. You do your own thing. But if you can't do that with Gaza without being attacked in this way, then the unilateral withdrawal model is cast into severe doubt among the Israeli body politic.
Yeah, and, it's also worth noting, Gaza has been a recipient of huge amounts of aid, a lot of which has been sort of funneled into Hamas's basically military activities of arming itself, building tunnels under Gaza, which is likely to be a source of huge loss of human life if Israel follows through with its plan to kind of root out Hamas. So, in other words, this tunnel network is really, in a way, the crux of the issue, as I understand it, of the sheer difficulty of this operation they've set out for themselves. It's been in this odd limbo, but the usual kind of way of describing it as an open air prison is essentially premised on the point that it's blockaded. There are limits on its borders into both Israel and Egypt. It's not really surprising that this is the case, and I think, as you say, it sort of raises just huge questions as to, clearly any state that was adjacent to a territory ruled by a party who, which set that state's destruction in its charter would heavily militarize the border along that state. This isn't a particularly unusual thing. There has been huge amounts of humanitarian aid that has been, again, kind of funneled by Hamas into their efforts. This stuff is never really discussed on the kind of left end of things. The Hamas leadership has shown itself to be pretty callous as far as, its own people. So, none of that is discussed. It's a very odd situation. It's so sort of tangled and difficult to make sense of, and it always comes back to this question of sort of who was in the wrong first. It's not a question that's ever going to be resolved. Any sort of argument premised on that is going to, perpetuate a completely futile and incredibly destructive conflict. It's remarkable to see how intractable this is, and in a way, how 20 years ago you wouldn't have seen such an outpouring of sympathy for these kind of reactionary Islamist forces from the left. I mean, they were sort of seen as a sort of regrettable sort of strategic necessity to kind of make some excuses for what they do, but they weren't seen as just like obvious allies. And now it seems as if there's just a kind of understanding of them as entirely in the right and not, and people who you can't even question.
With that, thanks to Geoff, Sohrab, and Nina, and thanks to you listeners. Go to compactmag.com. A lot more coming in the coming days on this. If you haven't yet done so, you can subscribe. compactmag.com/subscribe. With that, thanks to Geoff, Sohrab, and Nina, and thanks to you listeners. Go to compactmag.com. A lot more coming in the coming days on this. If you haven't yet done so, you can subscribe. compactmag.com/subscribe.